They set off to make history, and instead became a footnote, because nothing says adventures like vanishing into the unknown with a wildly optimistic map and zero return policy. What follows is the tale of those who embarked on journeys from which they would never return. Explorers whose final chapters remain unwritten, whose bodies never recovered, whose fates became as enigmatic as the territories they sought to chart. While their contemporaries received heroes' welcomes, these unfortunate souls earned only memorial plaques and speculative documentaries. So settle in as we traverse the globe in search of those who ventured forth with grand ambitions, but forgot to pack the most essential item of all, a ticket home. Percy Fawcett, the Lost Explorer. If one were building the perfect template for a British explorer, complete with magnificent moustache, unshakable self-confidence, and a remarkable ability to alienate fellow countrymen, Percy Harrison Fawcett would be the gold standard. Born in 1867 to a family with just enough aristocratic connections to be dangerous, Fawcett seemed destined for the conventional path of military service until the mapping bug bit him rather severely. After training at the Royal Geographical Society, where one presumably learned the proper way to plant a flag while looking suitably imperial, Fawcett was dispatched to South America in 1906. His assignment to map the border between Brazil and Bolivia, a task about as straightforward as splitting a bill among 20 drunk mathematicians. But where others saw inhospitable jungle, Fawcett saw opportunity. Where rational men feared deadly creatures, disease and hostile tribes, Fawcett somehow saw a shortcut to immortality. His early expeditions were successful enough to be dangerous, feeding his growing conviction that he possessed almost supernatural survival abilities. Local guides would fall ill, Fawcett would march on. Companions would collapse from exhaustion. Fawcett would merely adjust his mustache and continue. The jungle, it seemed, had met its match in this particularly stubborn Englishman. But it was the lure of a lost city that would ultimately consume him. Fawcett became fixated on the idea of an ancient civilization hidden in the Brazilian jungle, a place he called Z. While his contemporaries at the Royal Geographical Society coughed politely into their handkerchiefs at such fanciful notions, Fawcett compiled historical records, indigenous legends, and colonial accounts that he believed confirmed Z's existence. The fact that no tangible evidence existed only made the quest more appealing. After all, what's the point of discovery if someone's beaten you to it? In 1925, at the rather inadvisable age of 58, Fawcett embarked on his final expedition with his 21-year-old son Jack and Jack's friend Roly Rimmel. With characteristic British understatement, Fawcett informed his wife, "If with all my experience we can't make it, there's not much hope for others." One imagines he delivered this line while packing woefully inadequate supplies and rejecting sensible advice. They entered the jungle in April 1925. The last communication came in a letter dated May 29th, where Fawcett wrote they were preparing to enter unexplored territory. After that, nothing but silence and speculation. What followed was perhaps the only thing more ill-advised than Fawcett's expedition. Dozens of rescue missions that resulted in even more deaths. Over 100 people may have perished searching for the man who was searching for a city that likely never existed. If there's a more fitting metaphor for the cascading folly of obsessive exploration, it has yet to be discovered. Theories about Fawcett's fate abound. Perhaps he was killed by indigenous tribes, though Fawcett prided himself on his respectful approach to native peoples, a refreshingly enlightened attitude for a man of his era, even if it didn't prevent him from trespassing on their land in search of mythical cities. Others suggest he may have decided to go native, abandoning Western civilization for some Amazonian utopia, though this theory rather conveniently ignores the disappearance of his son and friend. The most likely explanation is also the most mundane. The jungle, with its myriad ways of killing the unprepared, simply claimed 3 more victims. Disease, starvation, accident, or animal attack. The Amazon offers a veritable buffet of deadly options, all of them more plausible than secret cities or voluntary exile. In 2005, Fawcett's granddaughter traveled to Brazil and was apparently presented with human bones and Fawcett's brass nameplate by a tribal elder. DNA tests proved inconclusive, which seems a fitting end to a story that remains, like Fawcett's lost city, tantalizingly beyond our grasp. If there's a lesson in Fawcett's tale, it might be this: conviction without evidence is a compass that points wherever its owner wishes, and in the unforgiving wilderness, such navigation tools are worse than useless, they're deadly. George Mallory, The Everest Mystery. Because it's there, 3 words that have launched 1,000 mountaineering misadventures and provided the perfect epitaph for a man who may have reached the top of the world only to never tell the tale. George Mallory wasn't born with an ice axe in his hand, contrary to what his later obsession might suggest. Born in 1886 to a clergyman father in Cheshire, young George initially seemed destined for a perfectly respectable life of academia. Educated at Winchester College and then Cambridge, Mallory showed promise as a scholar and educator, skills that, it must be noted, have limited utility at 29,000 feet. Mallory's first encounter with serious climbing came in the Alps, where he displayed an almost unnerving natural ability. Fellow climbers described his movement as floating up rock faces, a poetic description that unfortunately created the impression that gravity might make exceptions for particularly gifted Englishmen. It doesn't, as events would later prove. When World War I erupted, Mallory served as an artillery officer, surviving the meat grinder of the Western Front, only to later volunteer for something arguably more dangerous. For after the war, Britain set its sights on the ultimate imperial conquest, not another nation, but the very roof of the world. And Mallory, who had once climbed with the poet Robert Graves and had a talent for memorable phrases, would become its poster boy. The first British Everest expedition in 1921 was essentially a reconnaissance mission, with Mallory playing a key role in identifying a potential route to the summit via the North Colonel. The 1922 expedition pushed higher, but ended in tragedy when an avalanche killed 7 porters. Mallory, who was leading the group, was haunted by the disaster, yet somehow interpreted this not as a warning but as an invitation to try again. By 1924, Mallory was 37, rather late in life to be gambling with the thin air above 8,000 meters, particularly in an era before oxygen bottles, Gore-Tex, satellite phones, and the myriad other technological crutches that modern climbers employ. Yet there he was, making one final attempt at the summit that had already rejected him twice. For this last expedition, Mallory was paired with the young Andrew Sandy Irvine, an Oxford rower with limited climbing experience, but mechanical aptitude, useful for managing the primitive oxygen equipment. On June 8, 1924, the 2 men departed their high camp for the summit. Fellow expeditioner Noel Odell would later report seeing them climbing at 12:50 p.m., going strong for the top. It was the last time anyone saw them alive. For 75 years, whether Mallory and Irvine reached the summit before perishing remained mountaineering's greatest mystery, a question that mattered far more to the British public than it likely did to the frozen remains on Everest's north face. Then in 1999, an expedition found Mallory's body at 26,760 feet, remarkably preserved by the cold, his fingers still clutching the rope that had failed to save him from a fatal fall. Tellingly absent was the photograph of his wife Ruth that Mallory had promised to place on the summit. Present, however, were his snow goggles, in his pocket rather than on his face, suggesting he may have been descending after dark, perhaps after reaching the summit. But the final definitive piece of evidence, the camera that Irvine was carrying, remains lost, along with the young man's body. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay would indisputably reach the summit in 1953, but the question of whether they were truly the first humans to stand on top of Everest lingers. Mallory, who once wrote that the price of life is death, would likely appreciate the poetic ambiguity of his accomplishment. What's certain is that Mallory's frozen form joined the grim collection of corpses that now mark Everest's upper reaches like macabre signposts, a growing necropolis that raises uncomfortable questions about the line between exploration and hubris. For if the mountain has taught us anything, it's that human determination, no matter how fierce, must always negotiate with nature's indifference. And in such negotiations, nature holds all the cards. JEAN-FRANÇOIS de Lapérouse, France's vanished voyager. If James Cook was Britain's seafaring superstar, Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de Lapérouse, was France's response, a naval officer so talented that even his English rivals tipped their bicorns in reluctant respect. Born in 1741 to minor nobility near Albi, Lapérouse joined the French Navy at the tender age of 15, presumably having exhausted all the sailing opportunities available in landlocked southern France. His early career was spent doing what French naval officers did best in the 18th century, fighting the British. During the 7 Years' War, and later the American Revolution, Lapérouse distinguished himself as a capable commander. His crowning military achievement came in 1782, when he captured 2 British forts in Hudson Bay without losing a single man, a feat of such gentlemanly efficiency that the defeated British officers invited him to dinner afterwards. Nothing says worthy adversary like breaking bread with the chap who's just seized your fortress. But it was exploration, not combat, that would define Lapérouse's legacy and ultimately claim his life. King Louis XVI, when not being distracted by that pesky revolution brewing in his backyard, fancied himself a geography enthusiast, impressed by the voyages of Captain Cook, and not wanting Britain to hog all the glory of deadly Pacific exploration, Louis commissioned Lapérouse to lead an expedition to the Pacific in 1785. The voyage had all the hallmarks of Enlightenment ambition. Lapérouse commanded 2 ships, the Astrolabe and the Boussole, filled with scientists, astronomers, mathematicians, and illustrators. Their mission was to complete Cook's incomplete maps, establish trade, project French power, and collect scientific knowledge, a to-do list ambitious enough to make even the most energetic explorer reach for a restorative glass of Bordeaux. Initially, the expedition proceeded with remarkable success. Lapérouse navigated to Chile, Easter Island, Hawaii, Alaska, California, Macau, the Philippines, Japan, Russia, and Australia. At each stop, his scientists made observations, his artists sketched the locals, hopefully with their permission, and Lapérouse himself took meticulous notes on everything from tribal customs to ocean currents. Unlike many European explorers of the era, he generally treated indigenous peoples with respect, though this enlightened attitude wouldn't save him in the end. In January 1788, Lapérouse's ships reached Botany Bay in Australia, just days after the first fleet of British convicts arrived to establish a penal colony. The French explorer handed over his journals, charts, and letters to be transported back to France aboard a British vessel, a fortuitous decision that would preserve the record of his travels up to that point. After leaving Botany Bay in March 1788, Lapérouse wrote that he intended to continue exploring the Pacific before returning to France in December 1788. He was never seen again. The mystery of Lapérouse's disappearance triggered one of history's first international search efforts. Louis XVI, reportedly asking any news of Lapérouse on his way to the guillotine in 1793, had dispatched a rescue mission in 1791 under the command of Antoine Bruni d'Antry-Carsteau. This mission also disappeared, in keeping with the apparent French tradition of exploratory vanishing acts. It would take 40 years before the first clues emerged. In 1826, an Irish captain named Peter Dillon found French swords and other artifacts on the island of Vanikoro in the Santa Cruz group of the Solomon Islands. Further investigation revealed that both of Lapérouse's ships had been wrecked on Vanikoro's treacherous reefs. Some survivors apparently built a small vessel from the wreckage and set sail, never to be seen again. Others remained on the island, with local oral tradition suggesting they lived for years before dying or departing. In 2005, a DNA analysis of bones found on Vanikoro confirmed at least one of LAPÉROUSE's men died on the island. The mystery wasn't completely solved, but the broad outlines emerged, a classic tale of ships versus reefs, with the reefs emerging victorious. The irony of LAPÉROUSE's fate is that while he personally vanished, much of his work survived through the records he prudently sent home from Botany Bay. His contributions to Pacific cartography, ethnography, and natural history were significant, though one suspects he would have preferred a bit less posthumous fame and a bit more actual survival. Louis XVI never got his answer about LAPÉROUSE, but perhaps there's a certain poetry in that. Both king and explorer, emblems of pre-revolutionary France's global ambitions, vanished into history's mists, leaving behind only fragments for future generations to piece together. Gaspar CORTE-REAL, the vanished navigator. In the grand competition of who can claim the most land with the fewest ships, Portugal punched well above its weight during the Age of Discovery. Among its roster of ambitious navigators was Gaspar CORTE-REAL, a man whose family seemed determined to disappear into the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, one brother at a time. Born around 1450 to a family of minor nobility in the Azores, the CORTE-REAL family had already established themselves as seafarers of note. Gaspar's father João had reportedly sighted land west of the Azores decades before Columbus's more famous journey. Whether this tale was true, or simply Portuguese attempt to retroactively claim discovery priority, is a question best left to particularly quarrelsome maritime historians. By the late 15th century, Portugal had already established its dominance along the African coast and secured the route to India around the Cape of Good Hope. But the discovery of new lands to the west by Columbus under the Spanish flag created a problem for the Portuguese crown. The 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas had divided the undiscovered world between Spain and Portugal along a north-south line. With Spain claiming the choicest parts of the Caribbean and Central America, Portugal needed its own foothold in the Americas. Enter Gaspar CORTE-REAL, who in 1500 received a royal charter from King Manuel III to explore the northwest. The charter granted him governorship of any lands he might discover, a generous offer considering no one knew if such lands existed or whether they might be inhabited by people who might object to being suddenly discovered and governed by a Portuguese gentleman. In 1500, Gaspar set sail from Lisbon, reached what was likely Greenland, but was prevented from landing by pack ice. Undeterred, because if there's one quality explorers possess in abundance, it's the ability to interpret near-death experiences as minor setbacks. He tried again in 1501 with 3 ships. This time, CORTE-REAL reached Newfoundland and possibly Labrador. Finding the area inhabited by indigenous peoples, he did what European explorers often did when encountering new cultures. He kidnapped about 50 of them to bring back as evidence of his discovery. Only 2 of his 3 ships completed the return journey to Lisbon, with Gaspar's vessel disappearing somewhere in the North Atlantic, perhaps an early instance of cosmic justice for those kidnappings. Not to be outdone in the family tradition of vanishing, Gaspar's brother Miguel organized a search expedition in 1502. He too disappeared, having apparently failed to learn the obvious lesson from his brother's fate. A third brother, Vasco, prepared to continue the family tradition of disappearing in the North Atlantic, but King Manuel I, perhaps tiring of losing CORTE-REALs to the sea, forbade the expedition. Despite their unauthorized permanent relocations to the ocean floor, the CORTE-REAL brothers made Portugal's claim to Newfoundland and Labrador, which appeared on European maps as Terra Corte-Realis for some time. Their expeditions also provided some of the earliest European accounts of the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America, though kidnapping locals hardly qualifies as enlightened ethnography. The CORTE-REAL disappearances represent a familiar pattern in the Age of Discovery, ambitious men sailing into poorly mapped waters with inadequate technology, questionable judgment, and the unshakable belief that glory awaited just over the horizon. For many, like the CORTE-REALs, what actually awaited was a watery grave and a brief mention in exploration history, footnotes who dreamed of being headlines. John Cabot, the forgotten discoverer. For a man who discovered North America for England, an achievement that would eventually lead to the world's most powerful empire, John Cabot has received remarkably little historical fanfare. Perhaps it's because he vanished before properly capitalizing on his discovery, or perhaps it's because even his name isn't quite his own. Born Giovanni Caboto in Genoa around 1450, the exact same time and place as Christopher Columbus, in one of history's more suspicious coincidences, Cabot would later adopt the anglicized John after moving to England. Before that, he'd lived in Venice, where he became a citizen and learned the art of navigation and commerce. He then spent time in Spain and may have pitched his westward exploration ideas to the Spanish crown before Columbus, demonstrating that the sail west to reach the east concept was very much in the seafaring air during the late 15th century. By 1495, Cabot had relocated to Bristol, England, a port city with strong maritime traditions and merchants eager for new trade routes. Bristol sailors had been probing westward into the Atlantic for decades, possibly reaching the fishing grounds of the Grand Banks off Newfoundland before Cabot's arrival. These fishermen, sensibly more interested in cod than glory, kept their discoveries quiet to protect their lucrative fishing spots, perhaps history's first instance of commercial secrecy trumping national pride. In 1496, King Henry VII of England, annoyed that Spain was getting all the New World glory and potential gold, granted Cabot letters patent authorizing him to claim any new and unknown lands for England. The English crown, displaying its legendary financial prudence, didn't actually fund the voyage, leaving Cabot to secure backing from Bristol merchants. The arrangement was clear. Cabot could keep 20% of any trading profits, while the king would graciously accept the other 80% in exchange for having signed a piece of paper. Cabot's first voyage in 1496 was a failure, forced back by bad weather, food shortages, and crew disputes, the unholy trinity of early exploration problems. His second attempt in 1497 proved more successful. With a single ship, the Matthew, and a crew of just 18 men, Cabot crossed the Atlantic and landed somewhere in North America, possibly Newfoundland, Cape Breton Island, or Labrador. On June 24, 1497, he went ashore and claimed the land for England, presumably planting the flag with appropriate imperial flourish, while the indigenous inhabitants watched this curious ritual from a cautious distance. Unlike Columbus, who found Paradise Islands populated by people he could immediately exploit, Cabot found rocky shores, dense forests, and abundant fish, but no apparent civilization or gold. He returned to England with nothing more valuable than the news of excellent fishing grounds, and was rewarded with the princely sum of £10, enough for a nice outfit but hardly retirement money. The king, however, authorized a second, larger expedition, perhaps hoping that Cabot had simply landed on the wrong part of Asia and that China's riches might be just a bit further along the coast. In May 1498, Cabot set sail again with 5 ships and about 300 men. After that, silence. One ship returned to Ireland damaged by storms, but Cabot and the rest of the fleet vanished without a trace. Some historians suggest they may have reached America but perished there, while others believe they were lost at sea in the notoriously unforgiving North Atlantic. The bitter irony of Cabot's legacy is that while he established England's claim to North America, a claim that would eventually result in the largest empire the world has ever seen, he himself received little recognition and no wealth. His son Sebastian, who may or may not have accompanied him on his voyages, went on to have a distinguished career as a navigator and cartographer, happily allowing people to believe he deserved more credit for his father's discoveries than was strictly accurate. For centuries, Cabot remained overshadowed by Columbus in the exploration pantheon. Only in the late 19th century did historians begin to properly acknowledge his role in the European discovery of North America. Today, a tower in Bristol and a few statues stand as modest memorials to the man who gave England its first territorial foothold in the New World. Small recognition for an explorer who, like so many others, traded his life for a footnote in history. Franklin, Expedition, John Franklin, the Arctic Ghost. There's hubris, there's folly, and then there's sailing into the Arctic with 129 men aboard 2 ships named after terror and dread. Sir John Franklin's final expedition managed to combine all 3, creating what might be history's most extensively documented disappearance. Born in 1786 to a merchant family in Lincolnshire, Franklin joined the Royal Navy at 14 and quickly established himself as a capable officer, fighting at Copenhagen and Trafalgar. But it was exploration, not naval battles, that would define his career and ultimately claim his life. His early Arctic expeditions in the 1820s earned him the nickname the man who ate his boots after he and his men were reduced to boiling their leather footwear for sustenance during a particularly harrowing journey. Somehow, this near-death experience was interpreted as qualification for further Arctic command, rather than a sign that perhaps temperate climates might better suit him. By the 1840s, Britain was obsessed with finding the Northwest Passage, a sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific through the Arctic archipelago. Such a route would dramatically shorten the journey between Europe and Asia, bringing tremendous commercial advantages to whoever controlled it. The fact that the passage might be icebound for most of the year was considered a minor detail by men making decisions from comfortable London offices. In 1845, at the rather inadvisable age of 59, Franklin was given command of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror for what was meant to be the definitive Northwest Passage expedition. The ships were well equipped for their time, reinforced hulls, retractable screws, steam engines, and enough food to last 3 years. They also carried the latest wonder technology, canned food, which would prove tragically flawed. Franklin's expedition departed England with 129 men in May 1845. They were last seen by European whalers in Baffin Bay that July, waiting for good conditions to enter Lancaster Sound. After that, nothing but silence and speculation for years. As concern mounted, the Admiralty launched search expeditions, followed by private ventures funded by Franklin's redoubtable wife, Lady Jane. Between 1848 and 1859, some 40 expeditions searched for Franklin, making this quite possibly history's most extensive rescue operation. The search for Franklin ironically mapped much of the Arctic and ultimately discovered the various Northwest passages that Franklin himself had sought. In 1850, searchers found the first traces of the expedition on Beechey Island, 3 graves of crewmen who had died during the first winter. In 1854, John Ray, a Hudson's Bay Company surveyor, encountered Inuit hunters who possessed items from Franklin's ships and reported that the expedition's final survivors had resorted to cannibalism, a claim vigorously denied by Victorian society, which preferred to imagine noble British sailors perishing with proper decorum and all body parts intact. In 1859, an expedition led by Francis Leopold McClintock found a site on King William Island with skeletons, abandoned equipment, and most crucially, a written record in a cairn. This document, dated 1848, revealed that Franklin had died in June 1847. The ships had been trapped in ice for 19 months, and the surviving crew had abandoned the vessels in April 1848 to attempt an overland journey to the Back River. None survived. Modern analysis has revealed a perfect storm of disasters. The expedition likely suffered from lead poisoning due to poorly soldered food cans and antiquated water systems. Scurvy, despite the Royal Navy's long experience with this preventable disease, probably weakened many. The cold obviously did what Arctic cold tends to do to unprepared humans, and yes, evidence of cut marks on bones suggests that at least some of the desperate men did indeed resort to cannibalism in their final days. In 2014 and 2016, the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were finally discovered in relatively shallow water south of King William Island, far from where they were abandoned according to the written record. This suggests some survivors may have reboarded the ships after initially abandoning them, an intriguing wrinkle in an already complex narrative. The Franklin expedition stands as a monument to the deadly combination of imperial ambition, technological overconfidence, and nature's complete indifference to human plans. It also demonstrates the remarkable human capacity to interpret previous disasters not as warnings, but as challenges to be overcome by the next expedition. The Northwest Passage was eventually navigated by Roald Amundsen in 1903-06, but the warming climate has only recently made it a viable route. Cold comfort for Franklin and his men, who still lie scattered across the Arctic, their bones bearing mute testimony to exploration's brutal cost. Ambrose Bierce, the vanishing author. Not all who vanish do so among ice floes or jungle canopies. Some, like Ambrose Bierce, choose revolution, gunpowder, and chaos as their exit stage, proving that a taste for the macabre isn't limited to one's fiction. Born in 1842 in Ohio, to a family that valued books above comfort, they named all 13 children after historical figures, which suggests a certain scholarly pretension even in poverty. Bierce distinguished himself first as a Union soldier in the American Civil War. He fought at Shiloh, Chickamauga, and Kennesaw Mountain, where he received a head wound that would trouble him for the rest of his life. These bloody experiences provided ample material for what would become his most celebrated work, the short story collection, Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, grim, realistic war stories that strip away glory to reveal the absurd horror beneath. After the war, Bierce headed west to San Francisco, where he established himself as a journalist of uncommon skill and unprecedented acerbity. His column, The Prattler, became notorious for its wit, cynicism, and willingness to skewer anyone regardless of social standing. He was nicknamed Bitter Bierce for good reason. His pen could flay the skin off politicians, industrialists, and literary rivals with surgical precision. His most enduring work, The Devil's Dictionary, defined cynicism as a blackguard whose faulty vision sees things as they are, not as they ought to be. A fitting epitaph for a man who made a career of puncturing illusions. By 1913, at the age of 71, Bierce had grown weary of everything, perhaps even his own legendary bitterness. His marriage had failed, both his sons had died, one by suicide, one from alcoholism, and the literary scene he had once dominated was changing. With characteristic dramatic flair, he embarked on one last adventure, a tour of Civil War battlefields, followed by a journey into Mexico, which was then in the throes of revolution. In a letter to a niece dated December 26, 1913, written from Chihuahua, Mexico, Bierce wrote, "If you should hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think it a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs." With this characteristically sardonic farewell, one of America's greatest writers vanished from history. What exactly happened to Bierce remains unknown. Theories abound. Perhaps he joined Pancho Villa's forces and died in battle. Perhaps he was executed as a spy. Perhaps he simply wandered off to die alone, unwilling to subject himself to the indignities of old age and illness. Some even suggest, rather fancifully, that his disappearance was a final literary gesture, an author writing himself out of his own story. The most likely explanation is that he died somewhere in the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, one more unidentified body in a conflict that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. But the lack of definitive evidence has allowed Bierce's disappearance to become something more than a mere death. It's a mythic vanishing, a literary mystery that suits a writer who specialized in the unexpected twist. Bierce, who once defined alone as in bad company, found in Mexico the perfect place to disappear, a land in violent transition where record-keeping was subordinate to survival. For a man who had spent decades observing and documenting human folly with caustic precision, perhaps there was a certain satisfaction in becoming, at last, unobservable, in controlling the narrative of his departure as skillfully as he had controlled his prose. Unlike the explorers who vanished while seeking new lands or passages, BIERCE disappeared into a human wilderness, the blood-soaked landscape of revolution. Yet his vanishing shares something essential with those other disappearances. It captures the imagination precisely because it lacks resolution. In his absence, BIERCE achieved a kind of immortality that his continued presence might have denied him, proving that sometimes the most effective final chapter is the one left unwritten. René-Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, The River Adventurer. If there were a competition for explorer with the most spectacular falls from grace, René-Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle would be a strong contender for the gold medal. A man who navigated the length of the Mississippi, but couldn't navigate the complexities of human relations. La Salle's career arc resembles nothing so much as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition untempered by diplomacy. Born in 1643 to a wealthy merchant family in Rouen, France, La Salle initially seemed destined for the priesthood, joining the Jesuit order at 15. However, the young man soon discovered that vows of obedience didn't suit his temperament. After requesting and receiving release from his Jesuit vows, a decision the order would have no reason to regret, La Salle sailed for New France in 1667, seeking fortune and glory in the wilds of North America. Initially granted land near Montreal, La Salle might have settled into the comfortable life of a colonial seigneur, but hearing Native American accounts of a great river that might flow to the South Sea, Pacific Ocean, and provide the elusive western route to China, he sold his land to finance exploration, demonstrating the financial acumen that would eventually leave him dead in a Texas swamp. La Salle's early expeditions were plagued by the same problems that would dog his entire career: poor planning, difficulties with subordinates, and a remarkable ability to turn potential allies into enemies. Yet despite these shortcomings, his accomplishments were considerable. By 1682, he had navigated the entire length of the Mississippi River from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, claiming the vast watershed for France, and naming it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV, a territorial acquisition so enormous that even his detractors couldn't dismiss it. Returning to France a hero, La Salle proposed a scheme to establish a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi, creating a French presence that would control this vital waterway and challenge Spanish dominance in the Gulf of Mexico. The king, impressed by the grandiosity if not the practicality of the plan, provided La Salle with 4 ships and approximately 300 colonists for the venture. This is where La Salle's story transforms from merely problematic to catastrophic. First, he quarreled with the naval commander assigned to the expedition, resulting in divided leadership from the outset, never a good sign. Then, due to navigational errors and possibly Spanish deception regarding Gulf currents, expedition completely missed the Mississippi Delta, landing instead at Matagorda Bay in present-day Texas, roughly 400 miles west of their intended destination. As navigational errors go, this was rather like aiming for London and landing in Edinburgh, close only by continental standards. The colonists, who had signed up for a promising settlement on a major river, instead found themselves on a desolate stretch of Gulf coast with limited supplies and hostile indigenous neighbors. One of the 4 ships had been captured by Spanish privateers en route, another ran aground upon arrival, a third sank in the bay, and the 4th returned to France, taking with it La Salle's last direct connection to potential rescue. What followed was a slow-motion disaster. La Salle established Fort St. Louis, a rudimentary settlement that barely deserved the name. Disease, malnutrition, and occasional attacks whittled down the colonist numbers. La Salle, displaying the leadership skills that had alienated subordinates throughout his career, undertook several lengthy expeditions in search of the Mississippi, leaving the struggling colony to fend for itself for months at a time. By early 1687, with the colony reduced to about 45 survivors, La Salle set out with a small party on a desperate overland journey to seek help from French settlements in Canada, a trek of over 1,000 miles through unexplored territory. It was during this journey that his lieutenant Pierre Duhau and several others, long resentful of La Salle's imperious manner and blaming him for their predicament, murdered him near the Brazos River in March 1687. According to Henry Joutel, who witnessed the aftermath, La Salle's murderers stripped his body and dragged it into some bushes, where they left it without burial. An ignominious end for a man who had claimed a territory larger than several European nations combined for France. The mutineers soon turned on each other, with most dying violently in the following weeks. Only 6 members of La Salle's final party eventually reached French Canada to tell the tale. Meanwhile, the colony at Fort St. Louis lingered on until 1689, when local Karankawa people, tired of these strange Europeans and their inexplicable presence, attacked and killed all remaining adults, taking only 5 children as captives. When Spanish forces, alerted to the French incursion, finally located the settlement in 1689, they found only corpses and ransacked buildings. La Salle's legacy is a study in contradictions. His exploration of the Mississippi watershed eventually gave France claim to a vast territory stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Yet, his personal failings, arrogance, poor management, and an inability to maintain the loyalty of his men ensured that he would not live to see the fruits of his most significant achievements. Louisiana would remain a French territory until 1803, when Napoleon sold it to the United States in history's greatest real estate bargain. Perhaps the most telling epitaph for La Salle comes from his own king. When news of the explorer's death finally reached Louis XIV, the Sun King reportedly shrugged and said, "Had he been alive, I could not have received him well." Even absolute monarchs, it seems, had limited patience for explorers who couldn't find what they were supposed to be exploring. Vitus Bering, the ICA explorer. There's a special kind of irony in having vast geographical features named after you while your own remains lie forgotten for centuries on a barren island. Just ask Vitus Bering, or rather, ask his bones, which spent 250 years on the desolate spit of land where he drew his final breath. Few explorers have achieved such a perfect balance of geographical immortality and personal obscurity, a man simultaneously everywhere and nowhere on the world's maps. Born in 1681 in the Danish town of Horsens, Bering arrived in this world as the son of a customs inspector and church deacon, Jonas Svensson, and his wife, Anne. His birthplace, a modest port on Denmark's eastern coast, provided young Vitus with his first glimpses of ships and the sea, an introduction to the maritime world that would eventually carry him across continents and into the history books. His early education remains largely undocumented, though records suggest he received basic schooling before beginning his naval career at the remarkably young age of 15, when most modern teenagers are still arguing about curfews and homework. The Danish maritime tradition was strong, and Bering learned his craft sailing on merchant vessels bound for the East Indies. These early voyages exposed him to the rigors of long-distance navigation, the management of sailors, a species not known for their docility, and the complex logistics of maintaining vessels far from home ports. By his early 20s, Bering had developed into a competent officer with experience in both navigation and command, skills that would later serve him in the even more challenging waters of the North Pacific. At age 22, during the Great Northern War between Denmark and Sweden, Bering served in the Danish Navy, gaining valuable experience in naval operations. This conflict, though largely forgotten today, except by particularly dedicated Scandinavian history enthusiasts, provided the young officer with exposure to military discipline and the coordination of complex maritime operations, practical training that enhanced his already considerable seafaring skills. Then came a career move that might charitably be described as unexpected. Bering made the curious career choice to join the Russian Navy in 1703, abandoning his homeland to serve a distant empire with which he shared neither language nor culture. This was during the reign of Peter the Great, when Russia was frantically modernizing and importing European expertise wherever it could find it. Peter, with his characteristic subtlety, was determined to transform Russia from a backward, landlocked power into a maritime empire, a project requiring naval officers who actually knew which end of the ship was meant to go forward. Enter Bering, whose Danish maritime experience made him valuable despite the minor inconvenience of not speaking Russian. The timing of Bering's arrival in Russia coincided with Peter the Great's massive effort to modernize his nation along Western European lines. Having toured shipyards in England and the Netherlands during his famous Grand Embassy, Peter returned to Russia determined to create a modern navy essentially from scratch. This ambition required experienced officers, and the Tsar actively recruited foreigners with nautical expertise. Bering, with his Danish training and East Indies experience, fit the bill perfectly, despite his initial linguistic limitations. He would have arrived in a Russia still reeling from the social and cultural upheavals of Peter's modernization program, a land where aristocrats had been forcibly relieved of their traditional beards and long robes in favor of European fashions, and where resistance to change was often met with executioner's axe. During his early years in Russian service, Bering primarily operated in the Baltic Sea and the Sea of Azov, learning his new nation's language and customs while applying his maritime knowledge to Peter's expanding navy. Records suggest he married a Russian woman named Anna Christina Pulsa in 1713, establishing deeper ties to his adopted homeland. The couple eventually had 9 children, though several died in infancy, a sadly common occurrence in an era before modern medicine, when childhood mortality rates would horrify contemporary parents. After serving with distinction in the Great Northern War against Sweden, Bering caught Peter's eye and was assigned to a rather ambitious project, determining whether Asia and North America were connected by land. This question, which seems absurdly basic to modern minds, was still unresolved in the early 18th century. Cartographers had been guessing at the answer for decades, but Peter, no fan of guesswork, wanted actual evidence. The geographical knowledge of the time was a peculiar patchwork of precision and wild speculation. European cartographers had reasonably accurate maps of their home continent and increasingly detailed charts of the Atlantic, but the northern Pacific remained largely a realm of conjecture. Some maps showed Asia and North America joined by a land bridge, others depicted them as separate continents, and still others hedged their bets with conveniently placed decorative sea monsters obscuring the crucial region. This uncertainty wasn't merely academic, it had profound implications for trade and imperial expansion. If a navigable sea route existed between the continents, it could provide Russia with access to North American resources and potentially a shorter route to China and Japan. Peter's interest in resolving this geographical question also reflected Russia's broader imperial ambitions. Having secured a window to Europe through his conquests in the Baltic, the Tsar increasingly looked eastward, envisioning Russian dominance across the vast expanse of Siberia and potentially beyond. Knowing whether Russia's land empire had a natural eastern boundary or continued into a new continent was crucial for these imperial designs. The first Kamchatka expedition, 1725 to 1730, sent Bering across the breadth of Siberia, a journey of over 6,000 miles before he even reached his starting point for maritime exploration. This preliminary trek alone took more than 2 years and required hauling supplies, shipbuilding materials, and reluctant men through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. By the time Bering reached Kamchatka and built his ship, Peter the Great had died, but the Russian imperial government remained interested enough in the question to let the expedition continue. The overland portion of this journey represents one of history's most impressive logistical achievements, even if it's frequently overshadowed by the subsequent maritime exploration. Bering's party had to traverse the entire Eurasian landmass at a time when much of Siberia lacked proper roads, bridges, or reliable maps. They crossed countless rivers, mountain ranges, and seemingly endless forests, all while transporting several tons of supplies, tools, and equipment. The expedition employed a variety of transport methods, from horse-drawn wagons on the sparse roads of western Russia to sledges in the Siberian winter and boats along river systems when possible. Local guides and porters were essential, as was the cooperation, sometimes secured through imperial decrees, sometimes through diplomacy or bribery, of tribal peoples and frontier settlements. Bering's leadership during this phase demonstrated his particular talent for logistics and personnel management. He maintained discipline among his diverse workforce, which included Russian soldiers, skilled craftsmen, scientists, and local guides, each group with its own priorities and complaints. He negotiated with regional officials, managed a complex supply chain across thousands of miles, and kept the expedition moving despite illness, desertion, and the inevitable interpersonal conflicts of a large group under stress. In July 1728, Bering sailed north through what would later be named the Bering Strait. He observed that the coastlines of Asia and America appeared to be diverging, suggesting they were indeed separate continents. However, persistent fog prevented him from actually sighting the American coast, leaving his mission technically incomplete. Gabriel, a small vessel constructed specifically for the expedition, performed admirably in difficult conditions, but the notoriously bad weather of the region, a combination of dense fog, sudden storms, and treacherous currents, hampered Bering's observations. He reached 67°18' north latitude before turning back, having reasonably concluded that the continents were separate, but without the definitive visual confirmation that would have silenced all doubts. Bering returned to St. Petersburg in 1730, where his report was met with the enthusiasm typically reserved for mildly interesting weather forecasts. The imperial authorities, unimpressed by his failure to make a definitive landing on American soil, ordered him to try again. This lukewarm reception must have been particularly galling for a man who had just completed one of the most challenging expeditions in history. The Russian court, comfortable in their St. Petersburg palaces, seemed unable to appreciate the difficulties of navigating fog-bound Arctic waters in a small wooden vessel with primitive instruments. Their response essentially amounted to, "You've shown us the continents probably aren't connected, but go back and make absolutely sure, and while you're at it, claim some new territory for the empire." Between expeditions, Bering attempted to resume a normal family life in St. He also prepared extensive reports and maps documenting his findings, contributing significantly to Russian geographical knowledge, even if his conclusions were received with less acclaim than he might have hoped. Despite being in his 50s, an advanced age for the era, particularly for a man who had endured the hardships of the first Kamchatka expedition, Bering agreed to lead a second, even more ambitious venture. The second Kamchatka expedition, beginning in 1733, was one of the largest scientific expeditions ever mounted, a floating university with astronomers, naturalists, historians, and artists, accompanied by a small army of laborers, soldiers, and sailors. In terms of scale and ambition, it made Bering's first expedition look like a weekend fishing trip. Naturally, with more people involved, the potential for disaster multiplied accordingly. The expedition comprised several thousand men at its peak and required a staggering quantity of supplies and equipment. The total cost has been estimated at between 1/6 and 1/7 of the Russian imperial government's annual revenue, a financial commitment that would be unimaginable for a single scientific expedition today. This second expedition had broader aims than merely confirming the separation of continents. It was designed to map Russia's Arctic coast, explore and document Siberia's natural resources, establish Russian claims in North America, and potentially open trade with Japan. These multiple objectives reflected the growing imperial confidence of Russia under Empress Anna Ivanovna, who had succeeded to the throne after Peter's death. The scientific component was particularly significant, representing Russia's desire to participate in the Enlightenment-era expansion of knowledge that was transforming European intellectual life. After another epic trek across Siberia, during which various scientists wandered off to study interesting rocks or plants, requiring Bering to constantly herd his intellectual cats, the maritime portion of the expedition finally departed Kamchatka in 1741. Two ships, the St. Peter, under Bering's command, and the St. Paul, led by Alexei Chirikov, sailed east in search of America. These vessels, constructed in Kamchatka from materials largely transported across Siberia, represented the pinnacle of Russian shipbuilding technology of the era. Each was approximately 80 feet long, armed with several small cannon, and designed to withstand the challenging conditions of the North Pacific. The scientific complement of the expedition included Georg Wilhelm Steller, a German naturalist whose observations would provide some of the most valuable scientific outcomes of the venture. Steller was brilliant but difficult, a common combination in the history of science, and his relationship with Bering was often strained. The naturalist frequently complained that military concerns were given priority over scientific opportunities, while Bering viewed Steller's demands for shore excursions and collection time as secondary to the expedition's primary navigational and territorial objectives. The ships were separated in a storm on June 20, 1741, leaving each captain to make his own discoveries. This separation, while unplanned, effectively doubled the expedition's exploratory capacity, but also increased the risks, as each vessel lost the security of having a companion ship in case of disaster. Chirikov reached Alaska first, but lost 2 boats and their entire crews when they were sent ashore, presumably killed by native Tlingit people. Without boats to land, Chirikov had little choice but to return to Kamchatka, reaching it with a scurvy-ravaged crew. His journey, while overshadowed by Bering's more dramatic fate, was itself a remarkable feat of navigation and endurance. Bering, meanwhile, sighted the magnificent peak of Mount St. Elias on the Alaskan coast on July 16, 1741, a moment of triumph that confirmed the expedition had reached North America. He made a brief landing on Kayak Island, where expedition naturalist Georg Steller famously complained he had only 10 hours to explore an entire continent. This brief shore excursion allowed Steller to collect plant specimens and make observations that would later prove the expedition had indeed reached a continent distinct from Asia. Botanical evidence supporting the geographical conclusion. As the summer waned, Bering, already 60 years old and in failing health, decided to return to Kamchatka. This decision has been criticized by some historians as overly cautious, but given the lateness of the season, the deteriorating condition of both ship and crew, and Bering's experience with the region's harsh winters, it was likely the prudent choice. Nevertheless, the return journey would prove far more challenging than the outward voyage, transforming what might have been a triumphant expedition into a survival ordeal. The return voyage became a nightmare of fog, storms, and scurvy. By November, the St. Peter was blown onto the shores of what is now called Bering Island in the Commander Islands. Throughout September and October, the ship had battled contrary winds, navigational uncertainty, and increasingly frequent storms. The crew, already showing signs of scurvy after months at sea with limited fresh food, weakened daily. Bering himself grew ill, displaying the classic symptoms of scurvy, bleeding gums, joint pain, and debilitating weakness. The shipwreck on Bering Island was less a dramatic crash than a gradual stranding. Weakened by disease and unable to properly handle the vessel in storm conditions, the crew found themselves driven onto an unknown shore on November 4, 1741. The island, uninhabited but teeming with wildlife unfamiliar with humans, would become both their prison and their salvation. The crew, most suffering from scurvy, constructed makeshift shelters from their wrecked ship. They dug pits in the sandy soil, covering them with canvas sails and driftwood to create crude dwellings, hardly adequate protection against the bitter subarctic winter, but better than nothing. These sand huts offered minimal insulation and were constantly threatened by collapse, but constructing more substantial shelters was beyond the capability of the weakened men. Bering, too weak to walk, was carried ashore in a makeshift tent. His condition deteriorated rapidly as scurvy tightened its grip. Unable to move without assistance and suffering from the accumulated effects of age, disease, and the psychological burden of command responsibility, he gradually lost the will to live. According to Stella's account, Bering eventually refused food and treatment, seemingly resigned to his fate on this desolate shore. On December 8, 1741, he was found dead, half buried in sand that had seeped into his shelter, the sand providing his first burial before his men could arrange a proper one. The significance of this detail, Bering gradually being covered by the island's sand even before death, has a certain poetic resonance. It's as if the land itself was claiming him, beginning the process of absorption that would continue for the next 2.5 centuries. The surviving crew faced the daunting prospect of wintering on the island with limited supplies, and most men still suffering from scurvy. Their salvation came in an unexpected form. The abundant marine mammals that populated the island and surrounding waters, sea otters, fur seals, and particularly the now extinct Stella's sea cow, provided meat that contained enough vitamin C to gradually cure the crew's scurvy. Stella's scientific knowledge proved crucial here, as he recognized the potential food sources and devised hunting strategies. The winter of 1741–42 remained brutally challenging. The men endured constant cold, cramped conditions, and the psychological stress of isolation. Conflicts erupted over food distribution, work assignments, and leadership succession, now that Bering was dead. The executive officer, Sven Waxel, managed to maintain a degree of discipline, but the social order of the shipwrecked community remained fragile throughout their island confinement. Only 46 of the original 77 crew survived the winter, sustaining themselves by hunting sea otters and other wildlife. The survivors built a smaller vessel from the wreckage of the St. Peter and managed to return to Kamchatka in August 1742, carrying valuable sea otter pelts that would ironically make them wealthy and launch Russia's profitable maritime fur trade. This unexpected economic outcome would ultimately drive Russia's colonial expansion into Alaska and down the North American coast, as far as northern California, all in pursuit of the lucrative fur resources first discovered by Bering's shipwrecked crew. The survivors' return journey involved navigating more than 100 miles of open ocean in a jury-rigged vessel constructed from salvaged materials. That they succeeded in this final challenge, after all they had endured, stands as testament to both their determination and their maritime skill. Upon reaching Kamchatka, they rejoined civilization to discover they had been given up for lost months earlier, with church services already performed for the repose of their souls. Bering's remains lay in their hasty grave on the island until 1991, when a Russian-Danish expedition located and excavated his burial site. For 250 years, his exact gravesite remained unknown, marked only by a simple wooden cross that had long since disappeared. The 1991 expedition, combining archaeological expertise with historical research, identified a promising site and uncovered a burial containing the remains of a tall, older European male, along with artifacts consistent with an 18th century Russian naval officer. Forensic analysis confirmed the skeleton as Bering's, revealing that he was about 6'2", remarkably tall for his era, and likely died primarily of scurvy rather than the heart failure previously assumed. Modern medical examination also detected evidence of osteoarthritis in his spine and joints, suggesting years of physical strain, hardly surprising for a man who had spent decades at sea and traversed the breadth of Siberia twice. DNA testing compared to samples from Bering's descendants in Denmark provided the final confirmation of identity. The rediscovery of Bering's remains provided a tangible connection to this significant historical figure and allowed for a proper reburial with appropriate ceremony, a belated recognition of his contributions to exploration and science. The Commander Islands where he died are now a nature reserve, protecting the unique ecosystem, first described by Stella, and home to several species named after the expedition members, including Stella's sea lion and Stella's jay. Today, Bering's name graces a sea, a strait, an island, and even a landmass that doesn't exist. The mythical Bering Land Bridge is more accurately described as a land connection exposed during glacial periods. Few explorers have achieved such comprehensive geographical commemoration. The Bering Sea covers over 2 million square kilometers between Russia and Alaska. The Bering Strait, just 82 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, represents one of the world's most significant geographical boundaries, separating not just continents, but entirely different ecological systems. Bering Island remains a remote outpost of Russia, while the Bering Land Bridge, though only exposed during ice ages, played a crucial role in human migration from Asia to the Americas thousands of years before Bering attempted to determine whether the continents were connected. His expeditions opened the North Pacific to Russian exploitation and triggered a fierce competition for resources that would eventually involve British, American, and Spanish interests. The Russian-American Company, established in 1799, built on the foundations laid by Bering's discoveries, establishing settlements throughout Alaska and trading posts as far south as Fort Ross in California. This expansion set the stage for the complex international rivalries that would characterize the North Pacific region throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The scientific outcomes of Bering's expeditions were equally significant. Stella's detailed observations of flora and fauna provided the first scientific documentation of many North Pacific species. His description of the Stella's sea cow, a massive marine mammal related to the manatee but adapted to cold waters, remains our only scientific record of this species, which was hunted to extinction within 27 years of its discovery. Bering's cartographic work substantially improved European understanding of the North Pacific and Arctic regions, filling in vast blank spaces on previous maps with reasonably accurate coastlines and geographical features. Yet there's something poignantly appropriate about his death on a remote, uninhabited island. A man who spent his career charting the edges of empire, ultimately expiring beyond the reach of the civilization he served. For Bering, like many on this list, the journey proved more significant than the destination, though in his case, the destination proved permanently significant to his bones. Bering's story embodies the complex interplay of personal ambition, imperial expansion, scientific curiosity, and sheer human endurance that characterized the great age of exploration. He was simultaneously an instrument of Russian imperial policy, a contributor to Enlightenment scientific knowledge, and an individual testing the limits of human capability in one of Earth's most challenging environments. His legacy continues in the geography that bears his name, in the historical trajectory of Russian America, and in our understanding of the complex relationship between exploration, science, and imperial power. Perhaps most fittingly, Bering challenges our conventional notions of exploration success and failure. He died without returning home, his body forgotten for centuries on a remote island shore. Yet his expeditions achieved their primary objectives, significantly expanded geographical knowledge, and laid the groundwork for further exploration and settlement. In the ambiguous calculus of exploration history, Bering stands as both a success and a tragedy, his bones and his name scattered across the northern Pacific, permanent reminders of the cost and consequence of charting the unknown. James Knight, the doomed governor. If there's a lesson to be found in the tale of James Knight, it might be this: retirement plans are best kept modest, particularly if they involve sailing into Arctic waters at the age of 70. Knight's disastrous final voyage serves as a testament to the dangers of late-life career changes, especially when the new career involves ice-choked waters and dubious reports of gold mines. In an era when most septuagenarians were long dead or contentedly watching grandchildren from beside a warm hearth, Knight chose to pursue Arctic adventure and mineral wealth, a decision that would transform him from respected administrator to cautionary tale. Knight's early life remains obscure, a common problem with historical figures who weren't born to privilege. Historical records of the 17th century typically preserved the youthful escapades of aristocrats in exhaustive detail, while ignoring the formative years of commoners who would later achieve significance. We can reasonably assume Knight was born sometime around 1640, likely in England, and received practical rather than classical education. The absence of references to university training or family connections suggests humble origins, a man who would make his way through demonstrated capability rather than inherited advantage. We know he first appears in Hudson's Bay Company records around 1676 as a shipwright, suggesting he possessed practical skills rather than the gentlemanly education that opened doors in 17th century England. This entry into the company's service came just 6 years after its founding by royal charter in 1670, making Knight part of the first generation of English traders to establish permanent operations around Hudson Bay. His role as shipwright was particularly valuable in the isolated trading posts, where maintaining and repairing vessels was essential for both trade and occasional escape from marauding French forces. The Hudson's Bay Company in this early period operated a small number of trading posts along the bay's shores, primarily York Factory, Moose Factory, and Fort Albany. These crude settlements consisted of wooden palisades surrounding warehouses, living quarters, and workshops, frontier outposts, where Europeans huddled against the Arctic cold and conducted trade with indigenous peoples who arrived with furs to exchange for manufactured goods. Life in these remote posts was challenging even for young, healthy men. For Knight to have thrived there indicates remarkable physical and mental resilience. His rise through company ranks was steady, if unspectacular, marked by competence rather than brilliance. Knight's progress through the company hierarchy was methodical. From shipwright, he advanced to warehouse keeper, then to trader, and eventually to management positions. Company records describe him as industrious, reliable, and of good judgment, hardly the florid praise lavished on more charismatic figures, but the kind of solid assessment that keeps one employed in frontier trading operations where mistakes could prove fatal. Knight's career development coincided with a turbulent period in Hudson Bay's history. The late 17th and early 18th centuries saw ongoing conflict between England and France, with Hudson Bay becoming a remote but strategically significant theatre of these European rivalries. French forces repeatedly attacked English trading posts, capturing York Factory several times between 1688 and 1714. These military actions required company employees to develop skills beyond mere trading and administration. They needed to defend their posts, rebuild after attacks, and maintain operations under constant threat. By 1714, Knight had been appointed governor of the York Factory post, demonstrating both administrative ability and the survival skills necessary for Hudson Bay's unforgiving environment. This promotion came after his successful defense of Fort Albany during French attacks. Apparently, Knight could add military leadership to his diverse skill set. As governor, Knight would have overseen all aspects of the post's operations, from trade negotiations with indigenous groups to supply management, personnel issues, and correspondence with company headquarters in London. His tenure coincided with a period of imperial rivalry between Britain and France, with York Factory changing hands several times in the martial ping-pong match of colonial warfare. Knight proved adept at rebuilding the post after French attacks, a skill that presumably looked good on his company performance reviews. When the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 finally returned York Factory permanently to British control, Knight supervised its reconstruction and the re-establishment of trade networks disrupted by years of conflict. During his time as governor, Knight developed extensive knowledge of the region through both direct experience and information gathered from indigenous traders. He learned about the geography of the bay's western and northern shores, the migration patterns of the animals whose furs drove the company's profitable trade, and the complex relationships between different indigenous groups. He also heard tantalizing stories of natural resources beyond the established trading territories, stories that would eventually lead to his final fatal expedition. Having reached his late 60s, an age when most men of his era were either dead or contemplating the comfort of a fireside chair, Knight might reasonably have sailed back to England for a well-earned retirement. By any standard, he had completed a successful career, rising from skilled craftsman to colonial governor through decades of service in one of the world's harshest environments. He had survived French attacks, Arctic winters, disease outbreaks, and the complex politics of the fur trade. A prudent man might have considered these achievements sufficient and sought a comfortable conclusion to his days. Instead, he became fixated on northern exploration, particularly after hearing indigenous accounts of copper deposits and a strait that might form part of the fabled Northwest Passage. Knight's interest in these northern territories developed gradually during his years as governor, fed by conversations with indigenous traders who visited York Factory. Cree and Chippewa visitors brought not only furs, but information about lands and resources beyond the company's existing operations. They spoke of a great river flowing from the northwest, likely the Coppermine River, near which could be found stones of unusual redness and weight, almost certainly copper deposits. These tales, filtered through traders and interpreters, grew more enticing with each retelling. Soon copper deposits became mountains of ore, and ambiguous descriptions of northern geography transformed into promising leads for the passage to the Pacific. Knight, displaying the selective hearing common to men with a mission, interpreted these reports as confirmation of his growing obsession. The prospect of discovering both valuable minerals and the elusive Northwest Passage offered Knight a chance at the kind of fame and fortune that had eluded him in his long but relatively undistinguished career. In 1719, Knight returned to England to present his case for an expedition to the company's governing committee. His timing was fortuitous. The Hudson's Bay Company was under increasing political pressure to expand its explorations beyond the bay's immediate shoreline. Critics argued the company was failing to fulfill its charter obligations to seek the Northwest Passage, instead focusing narrowly on the profitable fur trade. Knight's proposal offered an opportunity to silence these critics while potentially opening new trading opportunities. At approximately 70 years of age, Knight received command of 2 ships, the Albany and the Discovery, for an expedition to Marble Island, off the western coast of Hudson Bay. His appointment as commander might seem surprising given his advanced age and limited maritime experience, but it reflected both the respect he had earned within the company and the particular nature of the venture. Knight's decades of experience in Hudson Bay, his knowledge of indigenous information sources, and his administrative capabilities outweighed concerns about his age and seafaring expertise. The Albany was a frigate of about 100 tons, previously used for company supply runs between England and the Bay. The Discovery was a smaller sloop of approximately 40 tons, designed for coastal exploration. Both vessels were reinforced for ice navigation, but were not specialized Arctic exploration ships, a limitation that would prove significant. Knight assembled crews totaling approximately 40 men, including experienced mariners like Captain George Burleigh and James Bellamy, to compensate for his own limited navigational background. His official instructions were to explore for the Northwest Passage, establish trade with northern indigenous peoples, and investigate mineral deposits. His personal conviction, recorded in private papers, was that he was about to discover vast riches that would eclipse anything previously found in the Americas. Knight's journals reveal an almost messianic belief in the expedition's prospects. He wrote of mountains of pure copper waiting to be claimed and of waterways that would certainly lead to the South Sea and to great wealth for England. These grandiose expectations far exceeding the evidence provided by indigenous accounts, suggest a man in the grip of gold fever, or perhaps copper fever in this case. The expedition departed from England in June 1719, well provisioned but fundamentally unprepared for extended Arctic exploration. Contemporary accounts describe the ships as carrying trade goods, mining implements, and even a prefabricated house, materials for establishing a permanent mining operation rather than for survival in hostile conditions. Knight, apparently expected to sail directly to Copper Mountains and convenient straits, establish operations, and return triumphantly to England with evidence of his discoveries. After stopping at Churchill, another Hudson's Bay Company post, Knight sailed north into increasingly unfamiliar and dangerous waters. The expedition's route took them along the western shore of Hudson Bay toward Marble Island, approximately 200 miles north of Churchill. This region was largely uncharted in European terms, though indigenous knowledge might have provided valuable guidance had Knight been more attentive to native warnings about ice conditions and survival requirements. Then silence. When neither ship returned to England or reported to any company post, concern gradually mounted. However, the Hudson's Bay Company, displaying the corporate responsibility one might expect from a 17th-century monopoly, waited 3 years before mounting a search. This delay, while seeming callous by modern standards, reflected both the realities of communication in the era and the company's pragmatic assessment of survival probabilities. With no word for multiple trading seasons, the company likely assumed the expedition lost and focused its resources on profitable operations rather than costly rescue attempts. In 1722, John Scroggs led a half-hearted rescue mission that failed to find any trace of the missing expedition. Scroggs, commanding the whaling ship Success, searched the waters near Marble Island, but found no definitive evidence of Knight's fate. He reported seeing pieces of wreckage that might have come from European ships, but could not confirm their origin. This inconclusive result left Knight's disappearance as one of the Arctic's many mysteries, a status it would maintain for nearly half a century. It would be nearly 50 years before the truth emerged, and it came not from official channels but from company whaling crews who visited Marble Island in 1768. There they encountered Inuit people who shared a grim tale that had been preserved in their oral tradition. The lengthy gap between disappearance and discovery is characteristic of many Arctic exploration disasters. The region's vastness and hostile conditions often delayed the discovery of wrecks and remains for decades or even centuries. According to these accounts, Knight's ships had become trapped in ice near Marble Island in late 1719. The Inuit reported seeing 2 European ships arrive that summer, attempting to find harbor on the island's inhospitable shores. They described the crews constructing a house or shelter on the island, likely the prefabricated structure Knight had brought for his anticipated mining operation, now repurposed as winter quarters. The crews managed to build a winter house on the island where most survived the first winter despite insufficient preparation for Arctic conditions. This initial survival is remarkable given the expedition's focus on mining rather than Arctic living. The men likely suffered from scurvy, cold injuries, and the psychological strain of isolation, but maintained enough cohesion and discipline to endure the first winter. The following summer, ice conditions prevented the ships from leaving, condemning the men to a second winter for which they had even fewer resources. By the second spring, their numbers had dwindled significantly through disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The Inuit described observing the Europeans from a distance, noting their deteriorating condition and increasingly desperate attempts to hunt and fish. Cultural barriers and possibly fear prevented more direct interaction that might have saved lives through the sharing of indigenous survival knowledge. The Inuit reported that by the summer of 1721, only 5 Europeans remained alive. These survivors, desperately thin and ill, continued to search the shoreline daily for food. Their number decreased to 2, and finally to a single man who, upon seeing approaching Inuit, fell to his knees and died. the last of approximately 40 men who had sailed with Knight. This final image, the last survivor collapsing at the moment of potential rescue, carries particular poignancy, suggesting the man's last conscious act was a reach toward human contact after years of isolation and suffering. Evidence from later archaeological investigations in the 1990s confirmed the outlines of this account, with the discovery of ship timbers, European artifacts, and a winter house foundation on Marble Island. These excavations revealed the remains of a substantial structure approximately 60 feet by 20 feet, likely the main winter quarters described in Inuit accounts. Artifacts recovered included ship's fittings, trade goods, personal items and tools, the material remnants of an expedition caught between mining ambitions and survival necessities. Most significantly, human remains discovered on the island showed evidence of cut marks consistent with desperate measures during starvation. This grim evidence suggests that in their final extremity, some survivors resorted to cannibalism, the ultimate taboo, but one repeatedly documented in the annals of Arctic and Antarctic exploration disasters. From the Franklin expedition to the Donner Party, the progression from starvation to survival cannibalism represents perhaps the darkest manifestation of the human drive to endure. Knight's folly, for it can hardly be called anything else, represents a particular type of exploration disaster, one born not of bad luck, but of willful self-deception. Unlike many who vanished in the course of well-planned expeditions, Knight sailed north on the wings of fantasy, chasing indigenous reports that he had twisted to match his desires. His ships were inadequately provisioned for extended Arctic survival, his knowledge of northern navigation was limited, and his advanced age made him particularly vulnerable to the harsh conditions he encountered. The fundamental error in Knight's expedition was one of category. He equipped and planned for a mining venture rather than an Arctic exploration. His ships carried trading goods and mining implements at the expense of survival supplies and equipment designed for ice navigation. He apparently believed the indigenous reports of copper deposits indicated easily accessible resources in relatively hospitable territory, rather than materials that might exist hundreds of miles inland across challenging terrain. Most critically, he seems to have dismissed or minimized the dangers of Arctic ice, perhaps believing his previous Hudson Bay experience adequate preparation for more northern waters. From a corporate perspective, the Knight expedition represents a fascinating case study in early exploration investment. The Hudson's Bay Company committed significant resources to the venture, providing 2 ships and considerable supplies. Their willingness to entrust this investment to a 70-year-old administrator with limited maritime experience suggests either remarkable confidence in Knight's leadership or, perhaps more likely, a calculated risk on a speculative venture. If Knight had discovered significant copper deposits or a navigable northwest passage, the returns would have far outweighed the initial investment. When the expedition disappeared, the company's response, limited search efforts, followed by apparent resignation to the loss, reflects the cold financial calculus of early colonial enterprises. Colonel Thomas Button, the Hudson Seeker. If being forgotten by history were an Olympic sport, Colonel Thomas Button would be a gold medalist. Despite leading one of the earliest Northwest Passage expeditions and making significant geographical discoveries, Button has been relegated to the historical equivalent of a footnote in tiny print, overshadowed by his predecessor Henry Hudson and successors like William Baffin. Perhaps it's because he had the misfortune to neither die dramatically nor succeed spectacularly, the 2 most reliable paths to exploration fame. Button's early life is obscure even by 17th century standards. Born into a Welsh gentry family around 1565, he entered naval service during the latter years of Elizabeth I's reign and continued under James I. His competence must have been considerable, as he attained the rank of admiral, no small achievement in a navy that was increasingly professionalized, but still influenced by patronage and connections. Button's moment of historical significance came in 1612, when he was appointed to command an expedition seeking the Northwest Passage, and, as a secondary objective, to determine the fate of Henry Hudson. Hudson had been set adrift in a small boat by his mutinous crew in 1611, after spending a winter trapped in what would later be named Hudson Bay. His disappearance had created both a mystery and an opportunity, a chance to rescue Hudson if he somehow survived while continuing the search for the elusive passage to Asia. Finding his way blocked by land, Button made the pragmatic decision to winter on the shore. Anchoring at the mouth of a river he named the Nelson after his ship's master who died there. This made Button's expedition the first Europeans known to have wintered in what is now Manitoba, an achievement that might have garnered more historical appreciation had it occurred somewhere with a more hospitable climate. Button sailed with two ships, the Resolution and the Discovery, the latter being the same vessel used on Hudson's final voyage. Apparently, sailors weren't superstitious about ships with catastrophic track records. The expedition entered Hudson Strait and proceeded into the bay, eventually reaching its western shore, a significant geographical discovery that demonstrated Hudson Bay was not, as some had speculated, the Pacific Ocean itself. Winter in the subarctic is never pleasant, but Button managed it with fewer disasters than many later expeditions. He maintained discipline among his men, organized hunting parties to supplement their provisions with fresh meat, and even conducted experiments on the effects of cold on various liquids, early scientific observations that would have been more impressive had he not been primarily experimenting with alcoholic beverages. When spring arrived in 1613, Button explored northward, searching for a passage beyond the bay. He investigated Rose Welcome Sound between the mainland and Southampton Island before becoming convinced that no navigable passage existed in that region, with his ships increasingly unsound after their winter in ice. Button made the sensible decision to return to England, bringing with him new geographical knowledge, but not the passage his sponsors had hoped for. Upon his return, Button compiled detailed reports and charts of his discoveries. He advocated for further exploration, convinced that a passage might still be found further north. However, his accounts were not published in his lifetime, and most of his original papers were lost in the Great Fire of London in 1666, a stroke of historical misfortune that helped ensure his obscurity. What we know of his voyage comes primarily from second-hand accounts and passing references in other explorers' narratives. Button returned to naval service after his Arctic adventure, serving with distinction in various commands until his death around 1634. His expedition, while not discovering the passage it sought, which didn't actually exist in navigable form, did advance European knowledge of North American geography and demonstrated that the western shore of Hudson Bay was not the coast of Asia, an important correction to contemporary geographical understanding. The irony of Button's story is that he survived his expedition, compiled thorough records, and lived a long and respectable life afterward, yet ended up less remembered than Hudson, who disappeared in the same waters. It seems that in the annals of exploration, an ambitious failure ending in death often generates more historical interest than a modest success followed by a routine career. Button's relative obscurity reminds us that history doesn't always reward competence as much as it memorializes disaster, particularly when the disaster makes for a more compelling narrative. Perhaps Button himself would have appreciated this irony, with the dry wit typical of a Welsh naval officer. After all, he achieved what many on this list did not. He went into the unknown and returned to tell the tale, even if history subsequently misplaced much of that tale. In exploration, as in life, sometimes returning intact is victory enough, regardless of what posterity remembers. Henry Hudson, the river namesake. Few explorers have achieved the peculiar immortality of Henry Hudson, whose name graces a bay, a strait, a river, and even an entire region, all places where things went spectacularly wrong for him. This geographical branding serves as a peculiar memorial for a man whose actual remains lies somewhere at the bottom of the bay, that bears his name, deposited there by crew members who had quite decidedly had enough of his leadership style. Hudson's early life is as foggy as the waters. He often navigated, born probably around 1565 in London. He emerges into historical record fully formed as a ship's captain in 1607, when he was hired by the Muscovy Company to find a shortcut to Asia via the North Pole, a proposal that suggests either remarkable confidence or a fundamental misunderstanding of polar ice conditions. This first voyage reached Spitsbergen, but found the way north decisively blocked by the inconvenient reality of a frozen Arctic Ocean. Undeterred by this setback, a quality that would prove both his greatest strength and fatal flaw, Hudson tried again in 1608, this time seeking a northeast passage around Russia. This attempt was similarly thwarted by ice, though he did manage to report walruses, which briefly excited his sponsors until they realized there was limited commercial potential in creatures whose primary products were blubber and impressive tusks. By 1609, Hudson had changed employers, sailing for the Dutch East India Company on his third attempt to find a passage to Asia. Encountering ice yet again in the northeast, he made an executive decision to completely ignore his instructions and instead headed west across the Atlantic. This unauthorized detour led him to explore the river that now bears his name, navigating upstream to near present-day Albany, before concluding that this waterway, while impressive, was not going to provide a route to China either. The Dutch were understandably perturbed by Hudson's freelance geography, but recognized the value of his discoveries, which would eventually lead to the establishment of New Netherland. Hudson himself, however, found himself unemployable in Dutch service after such a blatant disregard for instructions. Fortunately, for a man with a penchant for ignoring orders, the English were willing to give him another ship. His fourth and final voyage began in April 1610 aboard the aptly named Discovery, financed by the Virginia Company and the British East India Company. This expedition was determined to find the Northwest Passage through or around North America. Hudson navigated the strait that now bears his name and entered the vast bay beyond, a body of water so large that he initially believed he had reached the Pacific Ocean, an error that would have profound consequences. As autumn approached and ice began to form, it became clear that the Discovery would be trapped in the bay for the winter. Hudson had made no particular preparations for such a contingency, having apparently learned nothing from previous encounters with Arctic conditions. The crew was forced to beach the ship and construct crude shelters. As provisions dwindled, tensions mounted. Hudson, by accounts from survivors, did not handle the crisis with particular grace or fairness, showing favoritism and hoarding supplies, behaviors calculated to endear him to precisely no one during a life-or-death winter. When spring finally arrived in 1611, the ice cleared sufficiently for the voyage to continue. At this point, long-simmering discontent erupted into outright mutiny. Led by Hudson's former protégé Robert Juet and a man named Henry Green, the mutineers set Hudson, his son John, and 7 loyal or ill crew members adrift in a small shallop with minimal provisions and no weapons. The Discovery then sailed for England, with the mutineers concocting a story about Hudson being left at his own request to conduct further exploration. No trace of Hudson or his companions was ever found. They presumably perished from exposure, starvation, or drowning in the enormous bay that would subsequently be named for the man it claimed. In a fitting twist of poetic justice, many of the mutineers also failed to reach home. Some, including Green, were killed in a skirmish with indigenous people while attempting to obtain food. Others, including Juet, died of starvation during the return voyage. Only 8 of the original 23 crew returned to England, where they were arrested but ultimately escaped severe punishment due to the difficulty of proving their crimes and their value as experienced sailors. Hudson's legacy is paradoxical. His actual achievements as an explorer were modest. He discovered no viable commercial passages, established no settlements, and essentially failed in every stated objective of his voyages. Yet the territories he charted would prove enormously valuable to European colonial powers. The Hudson River became a vital artery for Dutch and later English settlement, while Hudson Bay would become the center of the fur trade that drove much of Canada's early economic development. Today, Hudson is remembered as a bold explorer who pushed the boundaries of known geography, while the uncomfortable details of his questionable leadership and the mutiny it provoked are often relegated to historical footnotes. Perhaps the truest testament to his complex legacy is that he remains literally unfound, his body never recovered, his final days unrecorded, his story ultimately as mysterious as the passage he sought, but never found. I'll expand both the Roald Amundsen and Belgrave Ninnis sections to reach a combined 4,000 words, with more historical details and context. Roald Amundsen, the polar pioneer. It seems almost unfair to include Roald Amundsen on a list of explorers who never returned, given that his career was defined by the opposite, being the man who always made it back, usually after having accomplished exactly what he set out to do. The Norwegian possessed that rarest combination in exploration, supreme ambition tempered by methodical preparation and a pragmatic willingness to adapt. That such a man should ultimately vanish without a trace has a certain cosmic irony that even Amundsen, with his dry humor, might have appreciated. Born in 1872 near Oslo to a family of shipowners, Amundsen seemed destined for a career in medicine until the death of his mother freed him to follow his true passion, polar exploration. This career change probably ranks as one of history's most successful, though it's unlikely career counselors will start advising medical students to try the South Pole instead. His father had wanted young Roald to become a doctor, and the dutiful son initially complied, studying medicine at university. However, when his father died, leaving Amundsen with a modest inheritance at age 21, the young Norwegian abandoned his stethoscope with unseemly haste and turned his attention to the frozen horizons that had captivated his imagination since childhood. Amundsen's early fascination with polar exploration was sparked by the Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen's crossing of Greenland in 1888, and reinforced by reading the account of Sir John Franklin's ill-fated expedition. Rather than being deterred by Franklin's tragic end, Amundsen was inspired to succeed where others had failed. With characteristic thoroughness, he prepared himself physically and mentally for the challenges ahead, even sleeping with open windows during Norwegian winters to acclimatize himself to the cold, a habit his housekeepers found considerably less admirable than polar historians would later find it. Unlike many European explorers of his era, who viewed physical hardship as ennobling and practically virtuous, Amundsen approached exploration with refreshing pragmatism. Adventure is just bad planning, he would later quip, a philosophy that guided his meticulous preparation for every expedition. He obtained his master's certificate to ensure he could captain his own vessels, and spent years studying navigation, meteorology, and the latest equipment. While his contemporaries were often gentlemen amateurs playing at exploration, Amundsen approached it as a profession requiring extensive training and specialized knowledge. Amundsen's apprenticeship in exploration came on the Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897–99, where he served as first mate under Adrien de Gerlache. This voyage, which became inadvertently trapped in pack ice and forced to overwinter in Antarctica, provided Amundsen with a masterclass in how not to run a polar expedition. The crew suffered from scurvy, mental breakdown, and near mutiny, lessons Amundsen filed away with Norwegian thoroughness. The Belgica expedition became the first to winter in the Antarctic region, though not by design. Poor planning led to inadequate provisions and no preparation for the psychological impact of the polar night. As scurvy ravaged the crew, it was the expedition's physician, Frederick Cook, later infamous for his disputed North Pole claim, who recognized that fresh meat from seals and penguins could prevent the disease. Amundsen, despite his junior position, emerged as a stabilizing force during this crisis, maintaining discipline and morale while others faltered. He later wrote that this experience taught him the crucial importance of diet, mental stimulation, and proper equipment for polar survival, lessons he would apply with remarkable success in his future endeavors. His first command came with the Geo expedition of 1903-06, which achieved the first complete navigation of the Northwest Passage, the same route that had claimed the lives of Franklin and his men some 60 years earlier. Amundsen succeeded where others had failed through meticulous planning, willingness to learn from Inuit survival techniques, and a pragmatic route choice focused on shallow waters where his small vessel had an advantage. The Gjoa, a tiny herring boat reinforced for ice navigation, was just 70 feet long with a 13-horsepower engine, absurdly small compared to previous expedition vessels. Yet this was a deliberate choice, allowing Amundsen to navigate shallower channels where larger ships would ground. With a crew of just 6 men, Amundsen set out from Oslo in June 1903, crossing the Atlantic and entering the challenging waters of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. When the expedition established winter quarters at what they named Gjoa Haven on King William Island, Amundsen seized the opportunity to learn from the local Netsillik Inuit. While European explorers had traditionally viewed indigenous peoples with condescension at best, Amundsen recognized their unparalleled expertise in Arctic survival. He studied their clothing, adopting the layered approach of caribou skins that provided better insulation than the wool and cotton used by previous expeditions. He mastered their techniques for building snow shelters, driving dog teams, and hunting. This cultural exchange proved mutually beneficial. In return for knowledge about survival, Amundsen's expedition introduced the Inuit to new tools and conducted trade. The expedition also accomplished significant scientific work, locating the position of the North Magnetic Pole and collecting extensive magnetic data. After spending 2 winters at Gjoa Haven, they continued west in August 1905, navigating the final challenging sections of the Northwest Passage before reaching Nome, Alaska, in August 1906. Amundsen had succeeded in a quest that had defeated and often killed explorers for nearly 4 centuries. But it was the race to the South Pole that would secure Amundsen's place in exploration history. Originally planning an expedition to the North Pole, he executed a breathtaking pivot when he learned that Americans Robert Peary and Frederick Cook both claimed to have reached that objective. Keeping his revised plans secret even from his own crew until they were at sea, Amundsen redirected his ship Fram to Antarctica, setting up a base on the Ross Ice Shelf in January 1911, deliberately positioning his camp 60 miles closer to the pole than his British rival Robert Falcon Scott. This deception remains one of the most controversial aspects of Amundsen's career. He had secured funding and the use of Fram, Nansen's famous polar ship, for an Arctic expedition. He had even sought advice from Scott about Antarctic exploration while concealing his own intentions. When he finally telegraphed Scott from Madeira with the message, "Beg leave to inform you Fram proceeding Antarctic," it was a devastating blow to the British expedition, which had assumed it had no competition for the pole. Amundsen's base at the Bay of Whales was established with characteristic efficiency. While Scott's expedition had multiple scientific objectives, Amundsen's singular focus was reaching the pole first. His team spent the winter preparing meticulously, testing equipment, refining their skiing techniques, and establishing supply depots along their planned route. Amundsen's use of dogs was not merely a transportation choice, but a reflection of his pragmatic approach. The dogs could pull the sleds, and as their numbers were reduced, could be used as food for the remaining dogs and the men themselves. This unsentimental approach to expedition management horrified British sensibilities, but proved brutally effective. What followed was less a race than a study in contrasts. While Scott relied on man-hauling and a complex mixture of transport methods, Amundsen went all in on dogs, skis, and simplicity. While Scott's expedition had multiple scientific aims, Amundsen focused single-mindedly on the pole. On December 14, 1911, Amundsen and 4 companions reached the South Pole, planted the Norwegian flag, and left a letter for Scott to find upon his later arrival. They returned safely to their base after a round trip of 99 days, a model of efficient expedition management that made their subsequent discovery of Scott's tragic fate all the more poignant. The journey itself was a masterclass in planning and execution. Amundsen's team, all skilled skiers, covered an average of 15 miles daily. They maintained a disciplined schedule, never pushing too hard on good days to conserve energy for the inevitable bad ones. Their route up the Axel Heiberg Glacier, while steeper than Scott's choice of the Beardmore Glacier, was ultimately faster. At the pole, Amundsen's team spent 3 days taking meticulous observations to confirm their position before beginning their return journey. Meanwhile, Scott's expedition encountered one setback after another. When Scott finally reached the pole on January 17, 1912, only to find Amundsen's tent and flag already there, his disappointment was crushing. "Great God, this is an awful place," Scott wrote in his diary, "and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." The contrast continued on the return journey. While Amundsen's team made it back to base with all members healthy, Scott and his 4 companions perished from exhaustion, starvation, and extreme cold, just 11 miles from a major supply depot. When news of the competing expeditions reached the world, Amundsen's success and Scott's tragic failure, public reactions split largely along national lines. In Britain, Scott was lionized as a heroic martyr who had died in pursuit of science and exploration, his last letters and diary entries published to tremendous emotional effect. Amundsen's achievement, by contrast, was viewed as somehow less noble, a mere sporting victory lacking scientific purpose. The Norwegian explorer, never comfortable in the spotlight, did little to counter this narrative, though it must have stung. Amundsen's next major achievement came in 1926, when he led the first verified expedition to reach the North Pole, flying over it in the airship Norge with Italian aeronautical engineer Umberto Nobile and American financial backer Lincoln Ellsworth. This completed Amundsen's polar hat trick. Having reached both poles and traversed the Northwest Passage, he had little left to prove. The Norge expedition represented Amundsen's adaptation to the changing nature of exploration in the machine age. Recognizing that aircraft would revolutionize polar exploration, he had attempted to reach the North Pole by plane in 1925, flying to within 150 miles of the objective before being forced to land on the ice. For the 1926 attempt, he partnered with Nobile, who had designed the semi-rigid airship Norge, and Ellsworth, who provided the substantial funding required. On May 12, 1926, the Norge departed Spitsbergen with 16 men aboard. After a 16-hour flight over the polar ice cap, they passed over the North Pole, dropping the flags of Norway, the United States, and Italy onto the ice below. They continued across the Arctic, eventually landing in Teller, Alaska, after a journey of 70 hours. This flight achieved what countless expeditions over centuries had failed to accomplish, and marked the end of the heroic age of polar exploration. The Norge expedition was particularly significant because it came just days after American Richard Byrd claimed to have flown to the pole and back in a fixed-wing aircraft. Subsequent analysis of Byrd's flight logs has cast serious doubt on whether he actually reached the pole, making the Norge's journey the first verifiable attainment of the North Pole. Amundsen, however, was characteristically gracious about Byrd's claim, publicly accepting it even while privately harboring doubts. The expedition's success was marred by growing tensions between Amundsen and Nobile, who felt the Norwegian received too much credit for what the Italian viewed as primarily his achievement. Their relationship deteriorated into public antagonism after their return, with Nobile publishing accounts that minimized Amundsen's contribution while Amundsen criticized Nobile's competence. The dispute seemed to confirm what many had observed about Amundsen's character. While brilliant as an explorer, his people skills often left much to be desired. Yet, retirement held no appeal for the restless Norwegian. When Nobel's subsequent solo expedition in the airship Italia crashed on the Arctic ice in 1928, Amundsen immediately volunteered for the rescue effort, despite his personal dislike of Nobel and the frosty end to their previous collaboration. On June 18, 1928, Amundsen took off from Tromsø in a French Lethsam 47 flying boat with a crew of 5. They sent one radio message reporting fine conditions and then silence. Amundsen's decision to join the rescue mission for his former rival revealed a depth of character that transcended personal animosity. In a radio interview shortly before his departure, when asked why he was risking his life for Nobel, Amundsen replied simply, "If I were in the same fix, I would be glad to see anybody who could help me." This understated commitment to the unwritten code of polar explorers that rivals on the ice remained allies against the greater adversary of the Arctic itself would be his final public statement. A widespread search found only a pontoon floating near Tromsø, presumably from their aircraft. Amundsen, at age 55, had vanished into the Arctic, the region he had navigated so successfully throughout his career. The ultimate irony was that Nobel, the man Amundsen had set out to rescue, was eventually found and saved by a different search party. What caused the crash remains unknown. Mechanical failure, poor weather, or pilot error are all possibilities. The Norwegian government officially declared Amundsen dead in March 1929, but his body has never been found. For decades, speculation abounded that Soviet forces might have shot down the plane and captured or killed Amundsen, but no credible evidence for this theory has emerged. The most likely explanation remains an accident at sea, with the aircraft and its occupants sinking in the frigid waters between Norway and Svalbard. In 2004, and again in 2009, Norwegian and Russian researchers conducted searches of the suspected crash area using advanced sonar equipment, hoping to locate the remains of the Latham 47. Despite covering hundreds of square kilometers of seabed, they found no trace of the aircraft. The ocean, it seems, guards its secrets as jealously as the polar ice. The final irony of Amundsen's disappearance is that it came during a rescue mission rather than an expedition of discovery. The man who had systematically accomplished every major polar goal died not in pursuit of glory, but in an attempt to save a rival. He personally disliked, a testament to the code of honor that unified the small fraternity of polar explorers, despite their fierce competition. In the years following his disappearance, Amundsen's reputation underwent a significant reassessment. The British narrative that had painted Scott as the noble scientist and Amundsen as the mere sportsman gradually gave way to a more nuanced understanding. Historians recognized that Amundsen's approach, learning from indigenous peoples, adapting to conditions, and prioritizing survival over heroic suffering, represented not a lesser form of exploration, but perhaps a more advanced one. His methods, once criticized as unsporting, are now viewed as the template for responsible modern expedition planning. Amundsen's legacy is one of methodology as much as achievement. His success came not from superhuman endurance or daring risks, but from meticulous preparation, cultural adaptability, and pragmatic decision-making. He studied indigenous techniques instead of imposing European methods, chose the right tools for specific conditions rather than clinging to tradition, and focused on survival first, with records and glory as secondary considerations. That such a systematic explorer should ultimately disappear without trace or explanation seems almost a deliberate reminder from the polar regions that no amount of human preparation can fully tame their fundamental wildness. Douglas MAWSON'S team Belgrave-Ninnis. The Antarctic Sacrifice. Belgrave-Ninnis did not set out to become the namesake for a glacier, though that's precisely what happened after he fell into one. The young British Army lieutenant joined Douglas Mawson's Australasian Antarctic expedition in 1911, primarily to care for the sledge dogs, but his legacy would ultimately be defined by a single misstep on a December day in 1912, a moment that transformed a routine scientific survey into one of exploration's most harrowing survival stories. Ninnis was born in 1887 to a family with polar connections. His father had served as a surgeon on the British Arctic expedition of 1875 to 76. Growing up in Streatham, South London, young Belgrave was raised on tales of Sir George Nery's expedition to reach the North Pole, with its accounts of scurvy, frostbite, and heroic endurance. Rather than deterring the boy, these stories kindled a fascination with polar exploration that would shape his brief life. His father, Joseph Ninnis, had returned from the Arctic with frost-bitten hands and feet, but remained an enthusiastic advocate for polar exploration, frequently inviting other veteran explorers to the family home. For young Belgrave, these visitors were living legends whose adventures sparked his imagination. Following family tradition, Ninnis was educated at Dulwich College, a prestigious English public school, where he excelled at rugby and developed the robust physicality that would later recommend him for Antarctic service. After graduation, he chose a military career, obtaining a commission in the Royal Fusiliers in 1907 and later transferring to the elite Dragoon Regiment, the Royal Scots Greys. His military training provided him with discipline and leadership skills, but the regimented life of a cavalry officer in peacetime England offered little of the adventure Ninnis craved. Perhaps it was these family tales of ice and endurance that drew the young cavalry officer to volunteer for Mawson's expedition when the opportunity arose. By all accounts, Ninnis was well-liked, cheerful, hard-working, and devoted to the Greenland Huskies under his care. He was also, as events would prove, tragically unlucky. Ninnis first attempted to join an Antarctic expedition in 1910 when he applied to serve on Robert Falcon Scott's Terra Nova expedition. Despite his enthusiasm and family connections to polar exploration, Scott rejected his application. Undeterred, Ninnis applied to Douglas Mawson's Australasian Antarctic expedition when it was announced in 1911. This time his application was successful, partly due to his military background, and partly because of his willingness to take charge of the expedition's Greenland sledge dogs, animals that would be crucial for the planned sledging journeys but with which few expedition members had experience. Obtaining leave from his regiment, Ninnis departed for Antarctica aboard the Aurora in December 1911, forming a fast friendship with Xavier Mertz, a Swiss lawyer and skiing champion who was also a dog handler. The two men shared quarters on the voyage south and bonded over their mutual love of the animals in their care. Fellow expedition members noted their camaraderie, describing them as inseparable despite their different backgrounds. Ninnis kept a detailed diary during the voyage, revealing his excitement about the adventure ahead and his deep affection for the dogs, for whom he fashioned specialized harnesses and spent hours training. The Australasian Antarctic expedition, led by the brilliant Australian geologist Douglas Mawson, established its main base at Commonwealth Bay in January 1912. Through the long Antarctic winter, the expedition members prepared for the spring sledging journeys that would be the scientific heart of their mission. Mawson planned several major sledging parties to survey different regions of the unexplored coast. Commonwealth Bay proved an exceptionally challenging location for a base, experiencing some of the strongest sustained winds ever recorded. Expedition members described having to crawl on all fours during blizzards to avoid being blown away. These conditions provided a harsh testing ground for equipment and techniques, with Ninnis taking a leading role in modifying sledges and dog harnesses to better withstand the extreme environment. His military background proved valuable during the winter months, as he helped maintain discipline and routine among the expedition members while they endured the long polar night. The winter was spent preparing equipment, conducting scientific observations, and planning the spring sledging journeys. Ninnis threw himself into these preparations, with characteristic enthusiasm, particularly focusing on the care and training of the dogs. He experimented with different harness designs and feeding regimens, determined to maximize the animals' performance in the harsh conditions they would face. He also became the expedition's unofficial physical fitness instructor, leading exercise sessions to keep men in shape during the confined winter months. For the Far Eastern sledge journey, Mawson selected Ninnis and Swiss ski champion Xavier Mertz as his companions. Their task was to explore the coast east of the main base, mapping and collecting scientific data as they went. The three men departed on November 10, 1912, with 3 sledges and a team of 17 dogs. Their progress was steady if unspectacular, as they navigated through fields of sastrugi, wind-sculpted snow ridges, and across countless crevasses. The journey began well enough, with the team making steady progress despite challenging terrain. They discovered and named new geographical features, collected geological specimens, and conducted magnetic observations. Ninnis maintained his detailed diary, recording both scientific observations and personal reflections. He described magnificent vistas of unexplored territory and the satisfaction of extending human knowledge into blank spaces on the map. The entries also reveal the growing bond between the 3 men as they shared the intense experience of Arctic exploration with its daily challenges and occasional moments of beauty. On December 14, 1912, approximately 310 miles from the main base, disaster struck with the sudden simplicity that characterizes so many Antarctic tragedies. The 3 men were crossing a region riddled with snow-covered crevasses, each taking a different path to distribute the risk. Ninnis was following behind Mawson and Mertz, guiding the sledge containing most of the food supplies, the tent, spare clothing, and 6 of the best dogs. The exact moment of the accident went unwitnessed. Mawson and Mertz heard a sudden alarming sound and turned to see that Ninnis and his sledge had vanished. They rushed back to find a gaping hole in the snow, a crevasse whose snow bridge had collapsed under Ninnis's weight. Lowering a rope into the darkness, they called for their companion, but received no response. The depth of the crevasse was later measured at 150 feet, with a narrow neck opening into a wider chasm below. Ninnis had fallen through this neck and was beyond any possibility of rescue, having almost certainly died on impact. Mawson later wrote, "We stood by the side of the crevasse, calling and calling, but no sound came back. After several hours of desperate attempts to establish contact, they were forced to accept the grim reality that their companion was beyond help." In his diary, Mawson recorded, "Ninnis has gone without a sound, without a thought, and without suffering. It is all too hideously quick to grasp." The loss was not just a personal tragedy, but a catastrophic blow to the expedition's chances of survival. The missing sledge contained nearly all their food, their shelter, most of their clothing, and essential equipment. The situation facing the survivors was dire. The sledge containing nearly all their food, their only tent, and most of their equipment had disappeared into the crevasse with Ninnis. Mawson and Mertz were left with about 10 days' worth of food and 310 miles to travel back to base. To compound their problems, the surviving dogs were weakening, and the 2 men had no choice but to begin killing and eating them to survive. In a desperate assessment of their situation, Mawson calculated they had food for just 10 days, while the return journey would take at least twice that long. They had no tent, though they managed to improvise shelter using a spare canvas cover. They had lost their spade, making it difficult to build snow shelters. Most of their cooking equipment was gone, forcing them to melt snow in a makeshift container. Perhaps most critically, they had lost the majority of their food, including the carefully balanced rations designed to prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Faced with these dire circumstances, Mawson and Mertz made the painful decision to slaughter their weakest dogs, using the meat to feed themselves and the remaining animals. Neither man had anticipated becoming dependent on dog meat for survival, and the psychological toll was significant, particularly for Mertz, who had developed close bonds with the animals during the long months of training and travel. What followed was one of the most desperate journeys in Antarctic history. Mertz, who had developed a particularly close bond with the dogs, suffered tremendously both psychologically and physically from consuming their liver, now known to contain toxic levels of vitamin A. His condition deteriorated rapidly, with symptoms including skin peeling off in layers, hair loss, and eventual madness. On January 8, 1913, Mertz died in the makeshift tent he shared with Mawson, leaving the Australian alone more than 100 miles from base. The consumption of dog liver proved fatal for Mertz, though neither man could have known the danger at the time. Vitamin A hypervitaminosis, caused by the toxic levels of the vitamin concentrated in the dog's livers, produced horrific symptoms. Mertz's hair fell out in clumps, his skin began to peel off in layers, even from the soles of his feet. He experienced intestinal pain, dizziness, and eventually delirium. In the confines of their makeshift shelter, Mawson watched helplessly as his companion descended into madness, alternating between raving incoherence and catatonic stupor. In the final days, Mertz's condition declined precipitously. He refused food and could no longer assist with camp duties. Mawson was forced to perform all tasks, melting snow, preparing meals, breaking camp, while also caring for his dying companion. On January 8, 1913, after a night of intense suffering, Mertz died in the tent, leaving Mawson entirely alone, still over 100 miles from the main base. Mawson, now reduced to traveling solo, cut his sledge in half to reduce weight, and continued the nightmare journey. At one point, he fell into a crevasse himself and dangled by his sledge harness over the abyss. Looking down at certain death, he famously thought, "It's a sliding scale of nothingness," before summoning the strength to haul himself out. When the soles of his feet began to detach due to malnutrition, he bound them back on with bandages and kept walking. Mawson's solo journey stands as one of the greatest feats of survival and determination in exploration history, suffering from the same vitamin A poisoning that had killed Mertz, though to a lesser degree. Mawson's physical condition deteriorated daily. The soles of his feet detached entirely, forcing him to wrap the dead skin back in place with bandages before continuing to walk. His hair fell out in clumps, his fingernails fell off, and his skin continued to peel away. He was severely malnourished and suffering from prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Despite these horrific physical challenges, Mawson maintained meticulous records throughout the journey, continuing the scientific observations that had been the expedition's purpose. He collected geological specimens when possible and recorded meteorological data. This commitment to scientific purpose, even in the most desperate circumstances, reflects the remarkable discipline that ultimately saved his life. The crevasse incident that nearly claimed Mawson occurred about 14 days into his solo journey. Having fallen into the crevasse, he hung suspended above the abyss, prevented from falling only by the sledge harness cutting into his body. The sledge itself balanced precariously on the edge of the crevasse, threatening to follow him into the depths at any moment. In this desperate situation, Mawson faced a stark choice: attempt to climb out or release himself from the harness and end his suffering. Choosing survival, he painfully pulled himself up the rope, inch by agonizing inch, finally reaching the surface after what he later described as the greatest physical effort of his life. Once at the top, he collapsed beside the sledge, later writing, "Several times I tried to bring my weight on the sledge to haul myself out, but could not get a grip of the slippery leather sledge harness. After multiple attempts, he managed to crawl onto solid ice, only to face the continued journey with even less strength than before." Against all odds, Mawson reached the expedition's main base on February 8, 1913, only to see the expedition's ship, Aurora, departing on the horizon. A small winter party had remained behind, anticipating this possibility, and Mawson was forced to spend another year in Antarctica before finally returning to Australia in February 1914. When Mawson finally staggered into visual range of the main base, he was initially unrecognizable to the men who spotted him. His face was black with frostbite and exposure, his body emaciated, and his movements those of a man at the absolute limit of endurance. He had arrived just hours after the relief ship Aurora had departed, having waited for Mawson's party well beyond the agreed deadline. In a final cruel twist, Mawson could see the ship on the horizon, too far away to recall. 6 men had remained at the base as a contingency in case any of the sledging parties returned late. These men were astonished by Mawson's condition and the story of his journey. They provided medical care, helping him recover from the physical ravages of the journey, while recording his account of the expedition and the fate of his companions. The reception of this news was particularly difficult for Cecil Madigan, who had become close friends with Ninnis during the winter months and had expected to share quarters with him again. Forced to spend another year in Antarctica, Mawson used the time to complete the scientific work of the expedition and prepare the records and specimens for eventual return to Australia. The wireless telegraph operator was able to send news of the disaster to the outside world, though detailed accounts would have to wait for Mawson's return. When the Aurora finally returned in December 1913, Mawson and the remaining men departed Antarctica, arriving in Australia in February 1914. The glacier where Ninnis fell now bears his name, Ninnis Glacier, a geographic memorial to a young man whose death sparked one of exploration's most incredible survival stories. The tragedy also contributed significantly to scientific understanding of the dangers of consuming dog liver in survival situations, though this knowledge came at an unconscionable price. Upon the expedition's return to Australia, Mawson formally named the glacier where Ninnis had disappeared the Ninnis Glacier, a 20-mile-long ice stream flowing into Commonwealth Bay. This geographical naming provided a permanent memorial, but perhaps more significant was the scientific legacy that emerged from the tragedy. The symptoms experienced by Mertz and Mawson remained mysterious until decades later, when research into vitamin A toxicity provided an explanation. Arctic explorers had long noted that dog liver could be dangerous, but the Mawson expedition provided the first well-documented case of its effects, ultimately contributing to scientific understanding of hypervitaminosis A. Ninnis himself was memorialized beyond the glacier, naming. His father, devastated by the loss, donated funds to establish the Belgrave Ninnis Memorial Prize at Dulwich College, awarded annually for excellence in science. The Royal Geographical Society posthumously awarded Ninnis the Polar Medal, which was presented to his parents at a ceremony that honored his contribution to Antarctic exploration. When news of the tragedy reached England, the London Times published an extensive obituary highlighting Ninnis's cheerful character and scientific devotion that had made him a valued member of the expedition. The story of the Far Eastern sledge journey became one of the defining narratives of Antarctic exploration, with Mawson's account, published in his 1915 book The Home of the Blizzard, establishing new benchmarks for survival against impossible odds. While Scott's tragic death near the South Pole has perhaps received more historical attention, many polar experts consider Mawson's solo journey the greater feat of human endurance and determination. Ninnis's body remains where it fell, encased in the glacier that bears his name, perhaps the most permanent tomb an explorer could have. As that glacier slowly makes its way toward the sea over centuries, his remains will eventually be carried to the Southern Ocean, completing a journey that began with a single misstep over 100 years ago. In exploration's catalogue of disappearances, few are as well located, yet simultaneously as unreachable as that of Belgrave Ninnis, precisely pinpointed yet forever beyond recovery. EVERETT RUESS, the vagabond for beauty. Not all exploration happens at the poles or in uncharted jungles. Sometimes the most profound journeys take place in landscapes already mapped but not fully understood, territories where the explorer seeks not new lands but new perspectives. EVERETT RUESS embodied this more philosophical strain of exploration, vanishing not into the blank spaces on maps, but into the soulful silence of the American Southwest. Born in Oakland, California, in 1914, Ruess grew up in a family that valued art, literature, and independent thinking. A sensitive, artistic child, he showed early talent as a writer, poet, and printmaker. By his teenage years, Ruess had developed a passionate attachment to wild landscapes and a growing disenchantment with conventional society, a combination that would ultimately lead him into the remote canyonlands of Utah and Arizona, never to return. Ruess began his wandering lifestyle at age 16, exploring California's Big Sur coast and the Sierra Nevada mountains. Unlike most explorers who traveled with specific geographic objectives, Ruess was seeking something more ineffable, a communion with natural beauty that he struggled to articulate but captured glimpses of in his journals, poems, and block prints. "I have been a searcher eager for the naked truth of life," he wrote to his brother, displaying a philosophical depth unusual for a teenager. By 1931, Ruess had discovered the desert landscapes of the American Southwest, the place that would become both his spiritual home and eventually his final resting place. Over the next 4 years, he undertook a series of increasingly lengthy solo journeys through the most remote regions of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and California. Traveling with only a few burros to carry his meager supplies, he lived simply, made art, wrote prolifically, and occasionally exchanged letters and artwork with his family to assure them of his continued existence. Ruess's writing revealed both a profound connection to the landscape and a growing alienation from society. "I have always been unsatisfied with life, as most people live it," he wrote. "Always I want to live more intensely and richly." In another letter, he declared with youthful grandiosity, "I'll never stop wandering, and when the time comes to die, I'll find the wildest, loneliest, most desolate spot there is." That prophecy would prove tragically accurate. In November 1934, at the age of 20, Ruess wrote his last letters from the small Mormon settlement of Escalante, Utah. He mentioned plans to explore the Davis Gulch country, a remote area of what is now Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. He restocked his supplies, adopted the pseudonym Nemo, Latin for nobody, and vanished into the labyrinthine canyon country east of the settlement. When months passed without communication, Ruess's parents organized searches. Trackers followed his trail into Davis Gulch, where they found his 2 burros in a corral fashioned from brush, with plenty of feed nearby, suggesting he had planned to return for them. They also discovered the word Nemo inscribed on the wall of a natural alcove, presumably by Ruess himself. But of the young man, they found no trace, no body, no equipment, nothing to indicate what had become of him. The theories about Ruess's fate are as varied as the dramatic landscape in which he disappeared. Perhaps he fell from one of the region's treacherous cliffs or drowned crossing a river. Perhaps he met with foul play, robbery, or murder. Some suggest he might have deliberately chosen to vanish, creating a new identity elsewhere, or perhaps even joining a Native American community. In 2009, a skeleton found in the region briefly reignited interest, when initial DNA testing suggested it might be Ruess, but more comprehensive testing later disproved this identification. What makes Ruess's disappearance particularly poignant is that, unlike many on this list, he wasn't seeking wealth, fame, or national glory. His exploration was deeply personal, a search for beauty and meaning in natural solitude. In his last letter to his brother, he wrote, "I have grown fond of desert wandering, the pleasure of wandering through the wilderness completely free, carrying my home with me, depending only on myself. It is glorious." In the decades since his disappearance, Ruess has achieved a cult following that would likely have both pleased and embarrassed him. His writings and artwork have been published in several collections, and he has become something of a patron saint for desert enthusiasts, solo travelers, and those who feel alienated from mainstream society. Authors, including Wallace Stegner, John Krakauer, and W.L. Ruscho, have written about him, cementing his status as a folk hero of American wilderness exploration. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Ruesses comes from his own words, written when he was just 20 years old. "When I go, I leave no trace." It was both his philosophy and, ultimately, his legacy, a young man who melted into the vast desert wilderness so completely that he became part of its enduring mystery.